William Shakespeare. There's a reason he's the most popular playwright in history. Shakespeare's been a household name for centuries, and you would be hard-pressed to find anybody who doesn't know about or actually hates Shakespeare. While he didn't pioneer the genre of theater, he certainly contributed to it. His legacy involves some of the greatest pieces of fiction ever written, and while some are much worse than others, they've all stood the test of time and are being read even today. The most celebrated of these plays would have to be his tragedies. But what is a Shakespearean tragedy? Well, the short answer is no one really knows. The genre of tragedy itself has been the center of debate for centuries, and everybody seems to have their own take and theory on tragedy, and almost all of them conflict or straight up disagree with one another. Keep in mind, we're not trying to answer what is a tragedy, because that makes the question even harder to answer. Authors and critics of literature spanning centuries have argued about this, and still no clear consensus has been made. Even when we narrow the lens down to Shakespearean tragedy, we're not doing very much, because society today doesn't seem to understand the weight of that title. Like a Shakespearean tragedy is now shorthand for something dramatic. Sometimes the phrase is so misused it's hilarious. Like seriously, if you Google the phrase like a Shakespearean tragedy, you are in for some high-tier garbage. Is it like a Shakespearean tragedy? All this is to say that we've seemed to have lost focus on Shakespeare and why his work was actually significant. Before reading any of his work, I knew that Shakespeare was a big deal, I just couldn't tell you why. By experiencing his work and actually putting my English degree to use, I've gotten to see why Shakespeare and his tragedies have such an important role in our lives. But to illustrate why that is, we have to ask the question, what is a Shakespearean tragedy? If we wanted to be literal, Shakespearean tragedies are plays written by William Shakespeare that contain elements of tragedy. There are often many characters, and the play usually ends with the death of several characters. Over his lifetime, Shakespeare wrote 12 tragedies, give or take. Now, we could stop there, but this video is worth 25% of my grade, so let's dig a little deeper. For this video, we'll be discussing 4 of Shakespeare's greatest tragedies: Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, the tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, the tragedy of King Lear, and the tragedy of Macbeth. These plays were considered Shakespeare's finest works, and among Shakespeare's other plays, they are by far the most popular to perform and adapt. When you ask somebody what their favorite Shakespeare play is, chances are they'll probably say one of these. Unless it's Romeo and Juliet, in which case they need to get better taste. These plays are quintessential tragedies, and I'll be going over the 3 major elements I observed to help us form our very own theory for a Shakespearean tragedy. I think it's worth exploring some general theory about tragedy because we'll see that some of the work has already been done for us. Again, while there is no clear consensus on an absolute definition, a lot of arguments help us understand Shakespeare's work better. German philosopher Hegel offers my favorite piece of theory regarding tragedy. In his Lectures on Aesthetics, Hegel states that the essence of tragedy is not moral conflict between right and wrong, but a conflict between legitimate rights and institutions. In other words, it's the idea that there are 2 ideologies not opposing one another, but existing together and causing conflict. Neither one is wrong, but neither is really right either. This is the first aspect of our theory. While vague, this definition actually gives us a lot of mileage because of how flexible it is, because the conflicts Shakespeare uses aren't usually black and white. Oh, no, wait, I didn't mean it like a race. Going in chronological order, let's look at Hamlet first. Hamlet is a revenge tale about a man whose father was murdered by his uncle. Now his uncle is king, who has married his mother, and Hamlet is rightfully angry. Normally we could just point at Hamlet and Claudius and say good versus evil, but it's not that simple. Hamlet is by no means a perfect character. His motivations may be righteous, but his methods and his actions actually put a lot of people in danger. Claudius, meanwhile, is just as ambivalent. He may have killed Hamlet's father, but throughout the play, Claudius is shown to be a benevolent king, a loving husband, and attempts to be a good father figure for Hamlet. Neither of these characters are truly good or truly evil. They are made interesting because of the conflicts they face. Hamlet has the right to kill Claudius, to avenge a murder, and to seek justice. On the flip side, Claudius represents the institution of Denmark. Claudius is king now, and no matter how he got there, Claudius represents sovereignty. As king, Claudius must uphold the law in the land, as well as his duty to his wife and his new stepson? Nephew? Huh. This is Hegel's tragedy, that both sides are justified, but neither can allow the other to exist. And if we extend this to other tragedies, we see that it works surprisingly well. Othello is the story of the Moor of Venice, a military general of African descent. Through the treachery and scheming of his envious lieutenant Iago, Iago is able to manipulate the cast of the play to help him ascend his way to the top. Iago is so devious that Hegel's standard appears that it will not work, but if we look beyond Iago, we can see a clear struggle that Othello is caught in, the supposed infidelity of Othello's wife Desdemona. Iago manipulated a lot of events to occur so that Othello would doubt doubt the faithfulness of Desdemona, and he did a pretty good job of it. Othello's struggle is one of emotion versus reason. Othello is completely justified in becoming emotional over the idea that his darling Desdemona would cheat on him, but he forgets about the institution that bound them. Marriage. Desdemona made a promise to Othello, and the struggle comes from Othello's head versus his heart. King Lear is the story of the King of England dealing with the onset of senility and his 3 daughters. After a test to prove his daughter's affection to him, he divides his kingdom, and the ensuing act causes him to go to war with his own daughters. This play is a bit trickier because it has so many characters and subplots, so I'll focus on my personal favorite characters, Lear's daughters. Lear's eldest daughters, Goneril and Regan, oppose the youngest daughter Cordelia in how they treat their father. Goneril and Regan praise Lear with empty words so that they can receive their father's land and inheritance. Cordelia, meanwhile, respects her father too much to insult his intelligence, and in doing so receives nothing. Goneril and Regan represent ambition, because their actions are done in the name of power, which because of their father's blessing they have the right to do. They go to war with their father because they feel no sense of duty to him and attempt to take his land. Cordelia's actions, however, are rooted in duty to her father. Even after she receives no inheritance and her father disowns her, she returns to him to stand by his side against her sisters. This conflict could be labeled anything, but I think ambition versus family is most appropriate. We see something similar happen with Albany and Kent, choosing to either desert the king or stand by him. Macbeth is the story of a young Scottish knight who, after being told by witches his destiny to become king, decides to take fate into his own hands by murdering the king and taking the throne for himself, only to become a tyrant himself and perpetuate Scotland's cycle of bad kings. Macbeth shares many of its themes with King Lear and Hamlet, but it prominently features the idea of fate, which heavily clashes with Macbeth's sense of honor as a knight. Macbeth swears loyalty to King Duncan and has fought beside him in many battles. He is a man of chivalry. Macbeth is given the right to pursue his fate, but at the cost of betraying his chivalry. These motives and conflicts make the play so much more interesting, because when you don't look at characters as heroes or villains, they become so much more realistic. But these conflicts aren't the only thing that makes these plays great. If you have good conflict, you need to have good characters, which Shakespeare happens to have in spades. Another great piece of theory we can look at is Aristotle's theory on tragedy. Yes, that Aristotle. It turns out when this guy wasn't furthering philosophy or science, he was watching plays. Go figure. According to Aristotle, tragedy has 6 elements: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song. And if we're being completely honest, I have absolutely no clue what half of these are. But of these, we are interested in 2, the first one being character. One of the hallmarks of Shakespeare's tragedies is their protagonists. You look at the 4 great plays and you see these amazingly developed protagonists that feel like real people. Whether they are Danish, Venetian, English, or Scottish, you get to see these characters grow and struggle and have internal conflict. English Shakespearean critic A.C. Bradley has pointed out in almost all of his lectures that the protagonist must possess some sort of flaw that allows them to make mistakes and to become tragic. This is what we call a tragic flaw, a flaw that both defines a character and dictates their actions. You can point to any one of Shakespeare's characters and find a tragic flaw, but it's most obvious with the protagonists. With Hamlet, he is unfortunately hesitant, which leads to several delays to his plan, as well as the decline of his sanity and the needless deaths of several of his loved ones. Othello's intense jealousy and sensitivity lead him to jump to conclusions and kill both Desdemona and himself. King Lear's need to be praised, or approval, lead to the events of the story and the eventual deaths of most of the cast. And Macbeth's ambition and lust for power leads to one of the bloodiest plays not just in Shakespeare plays, but in theater. These flaws are great because they both make the characters sympathetic and drive the story. They aren't perfect, and that's what makes them great. One scene you'll be rooting for them and cheering them on, and in the next scene you'll be pulling your hair out because of how stupid they are.
Did you do it, Othello?
The other big element that all of our protagonists share is that they play a significant role in the world they inhabit. This isn't to say their immediate environment or simply what we can see on stage, but within the lore of the play itself. These dudes are pretty important. Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, the rightful heir to the throne, and could potentially affect the politics of Europe with his leadership. Lear is the King of England, and we see that he has a significant role in the world that he's in. He is the ruler of a massive kingdom, he has alliances with several countries, and he is the commander of what we can imagine is a massive army. Similarly, Macbeth becomes the leader of Scotland, and he uses both his influences and skills as one of Scotland's greatest warriors to terrorize Scotland and even threaten other countries. Othello is the odd one out of the bunch because he's not royalty, but even then he's still pretty important. Othello's prestige is known throughout the world as one of the most fearsome generals. He is implied to have killed hundreds of people on his own, and when it came time for Venice to launch a counterattack against the Turkish fleet, the Duke of Venice automatically proposes Othello to lead the attack. Alright, we're getting too positive. This is tragedy. We have to get depressing. You want depressing? Let's get depressing. Let's talk about death. You would have to be hard-pressed to find any collection of works with a higher body count than Shakespeare over here. Save maybe Game of Thrones? I don't know, I've honestly never read it. Over the course of these 4 plays, there are 32 deaths, which averages to about 8 deaths per play. Shakespeare loved killing his characters. It didn't matter if you were a main character or somebody who showed up for like one scene. If you appeared on stage, there's a good chance you were going to die horrifically. Actually, the people most likely to die in tragedies were the protagonists. These tragedies were 4 for 4 with killing the protagonist, and even Julius Caesar joined in for the fun. And depending on who you think the actual protagonist is, Shakespeare's got you covered by killing them both off. Hey, covering all your bases, I like it. Good job, Shakespeare. I don't think we should overlook the fact that all of the main characters die in their respective plays. Shakespeare makes a point to kill them specifically, as opposed to several characters whose deaths are usually the result of unforeseen circumstance. This may be a stretch, but I believe these deaths were intended to improve the ending of the play. These endings are sad to be sure, but the deaths of these characters specifically adds another layer of tragedy to plays. It is implied that without these characters, the world that they live in is now much worse off because of their death. We looked at why each prospective protagonist was important to the world, so we can only imagine what their deaths will do to the world. Denmark has now been left without any heirs to the throne and will likely descend into chaos. Venice lost their greatest general, and with the opposing countries always a potential threat, they may not be able to defend themselves. England, similar to Denmark, has lost its heirs and has heightened its political animosity in Europe. Even Macbeth, after his reign of tyranny ends in Scotland, it is implied that this cycle of regicide and war will continue, just trading in one tyrant for another. These endings leave emotional impacts for sure, but they also make the audience wonder what there is left to hope for. While we're on the subject of death, let's transition into another one of Aristotle's elements of tragedy, as well as the last pillar to our theory: spectacle. Spectacle, according to Aristotle, is the employment of spectacular effects, which we would think of normally as special effects. This heightens the experience for the audience and bridges the gap between simply spectating and being immersed. Despite including in his own theory, Aristotle actually thinks spectacle is the least important element of the play. In his own words, "The spectacle has indeed an emotional attraction of its own, but of all the parts it is the least artistic and connected least with the art of poetry. It is complementary to the play rather than integral." While Aristotle's own definition may fit that though, I actually have a different understanding of spectacle. Instead of simply being special effects, spectacle is the visual impact of the performance. To understand what I mean, I want to look beyond Shakespeare for just a moment to show 2 good examples of spectacle in tragedy, these being Seneca the Younger's Thyestes and Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. This video's gone on way longer than I thought, so I'm just going to blitz through these real quick. Thyestes is the story of Atreus and Thyestes, brothers who hate each other. In an attempt to get revenge on Thyestes for the military conflict the two have been locked in for years, as well as sleeping with his wife, Atreus kills Thyestes' sons, his nephews. Oh yeah, spoiler alert for like a 2,000-year-old play. Atreus doesn't just kill his nephews, he butchers them and then cooks them into a soup, and then feeds it to a drunk Thyestes. I'm just gonna let that image settle into your mind real quick. Okay, good. Yeah, man, the Greeks were hardcore. But the worst part about this is that the play doesn't even show you this part. You don't get to see it. Instead, it uses what is called a chorus, a common element of Greek theater where either a single person or a group of people, depending on the adaptation, describe the act to you. Now, whether this was done due to technical limitations of the time or just because it was so gross, we don't really know. But to me, it just seems kind of lazy. Like, if you're gonna do something for shock value, go through with it. Oh yeah, when I said Thyestes was a good example, I meant it was a good example of how not to do spectacle. Meanwhile, Marlowe exemplifies the aspect of spectacle with Dr. Faustus. Faustus, also called Faust, is a theologian who gets bored one day and decides to summon a demon. He and the demon make a pact where Faust sells his soul in exchange for gaining magic powers for the next 24 years of his life. Faust lives the craziest bender of a life, and along the way he travels through space, meets the 7 deadly sins, messes with the Pope, and reincarnates Alexander the Great. As you do. When the 24 years have passed, the demon comes to get Faust, and the play ends with Faust literally getting dragged into hell by demons. In the heavily religious society this was written during, this would have been the scariest thing imaginable. The reason I bring this up is because the play not only uses spectacle properly, it makes sense from a narrative standpoint. The demon is constantly trying to distract and entertain Faust to prevent him from praying for his soul back. To achieve this, the demon must come up with increasingly elaborate spectacles. Thyestes and Faust make up what I call the spectacle spectrum. Another way to look at the difference between these two is the idea of showing versus telling, two techniques that convey events or ideas using two very different methods to achieve their goals. Both Thyestes and Faust convey spectacle, but Faust is by far the better example. Marlowe does this through actions and imagery and showing what is happening, whereas Seneca relies on summary and explaining. Even if Thyestes' big moment is more dramatic or shocking than Faust's, it undermines itself by breaking the flow of the story. Of these two schools of thought, Shakespeare very much shows rather than tells. Part of the reason Shakespeare's tragedies are so effective is because they are plays, and plays are meant to entertain audiences. Shakespeare was kind of like the Quentin Tarantino of his time, in the sense that he loved to convey conflicts in big ways. In all of these plays, you can find these grand moments where all of the characters' tensions and emotions explode, and we get to see everything they are experiencing. Going back to the Tarantino analogy, characters usually die in spectacular or dramatic ways. Hamlet dies in a climactic duel with Laertes, which ends with Hamlet, Claudius, Gertrude, and Laertes dying as a result. Othello, while not as flashy, delivers the emotionally driven murder of Desdemona and then kills himself after delivering his immortal "Remember Me" speech. King Lear cheats a little bit in this area because Cordelia, Goneril, and Regan all die off screen, but watching King Lear die from emotional exhaustion is absolutely dreadful. Macbeth may be the winner in this department simply because of how cool the final scene is. Watching Macbeth and Macduff engaged in a fight to the death, ending with Macduff decapitating Macbeth and saving Scotland from his tyranny, is so testosterone-filled and cool, and I love it. The spectacle of these scenes is not simply to make the scenes more effective, it also serves the function of layering meaning through visuals. Hamlet is a play characterized by a mixture of Hamlet's careful planning and inner chaos. The ending scene perfectly embodies this, with the methodic and deliberate act of fencing at the forefront, only to be followed by everyone dying almost immediately. Othello's murder of Desdemona perfectly mirrors Othello's silent yet intense fury, and it is only after Othello has maintained his composure that he kills himself. King Lear's death is that of a broken heart for Cordelia surrounded by his loved ones. This is fitting because this is how the play begins, with Lear becoming incredibly sad about Cordelia surrounded by all of his followers. Macbeth's death is so fitting because he died in fear of losing his crown, having it both figuratively and literally removed from him. I guess you could say he lost his head. All of these deaths could have easily been announced by our narrator or happened off-screen, but with the use of spectacle, Shakespeare is able to give them both meaning and impact to these scenes. And that's it. That's my theory on Shakespearean tragedy, expertly explained with a script that was written at 5 in the morning the day this was due. So going off of our working definition, a Shakespearean tragedy is a character-driven story that carefully utilizes spectacle to tell a story of a flawed protagonist whose conflicts are neither right nor wrong, whose fall from power results in a meaningful death that affects the world they inhabit. I don't know about you, but I really like that definition. Although I'm sure there are a lot of people that are going to disagree with me. I haven't found the definition, I found my definition. Because really, Shakespearean tragedy is whatever you want it to be. Yeah, I know this is a cop-out, but hear me out. All those dudes that debated about Shakespeare for so long, all these plays meant something different to them. They believed the plays were brilliant or inventive in different ways. Ever wondered why there are so many adaptations of Shakespeare's plays? It's because each play has so many ideas and themes to offer that translating them is so easy. I am one of 20 students asked to answer this question, and we all came up with different answers. Shakespearean tragedy is something different to each person. Shakespeare didn't write for any one person, he wrote for everybody. Shakespeare's work is so great because no two people will experience one of these plays the same, and that's not something you can say about other works. It's the reason why we're talking about him 400 years after his death, and while we'll still be talking about him 400 years from now. Thanks for watching.